Michael Bay is quite a controversial figure. For some, he's associated with a love of pyrotechnics, while for others, Bay represents spinning camera shots around the main characters or the famous yellow filter present in nearly all his films. And of course, there's probably not a single director in Hollywood who loves product placement as much as Bay does. But nearly every release of a Bay film becomes a true event. Audiences buy movie tickets en masse, and critics never miss the opportunity to once again rake the director over the coals, accusing each of his films of being cliché and labeling Bay as mainstream. The viewer and critic perceptions of his films vary so much that Bay could arguably be referred to as the people's director. This video will discuss how Michael Bay became beloved by some and synonymous with mediocrity for others. But first, some useful information. Michael Bay was born on February 17, 1965 in Los Angeles. Bay's mother abandoned him and gave him to an orphanage because she didn't want to raise Bay alone. Luckily, Michael didn't stay in the orphanage for long as he was quickly taken in by a young couple who raised him. Michael Bay's love story with directing isn't particularly unique. As a child, his parents gave him a camera, and little Bay never parted with it. When Michael turned 15, he knew for certain that he wanted to dedicate his life to cinema. Fortunately, he didn't need to move anywhere to achieve this goal as he was already living in the epicenter of the film industry, Los Angeles, which significantly eased his job hunt in the movie business. Bay landed a job as a director's assistant at Lucasfilms and started working on the film Indiana Jones: Raiders of the Lost Ark. Though it may sound glamorous, such practice is quite ordinary if you live in Los Angeles. And to be fair, Bay's role in the film's creation wasn't extraordinarily important. He mostly adjusted floodlights on the set and occasionally prepared coffee for Spielberg. But for a 15-year-old teenager, such experience was the stuff of dreams. Bay carefully observed the filming process and only became more firm in his idea to become a director, especially after he saw the final version of the film that he'd had a hand in making. After studying at Wesleyan University, Bay quickly started working as a director, albeit only for music videos and commercials. The most notable work from that period was the Got Milk campaign, filmed as part of an advertising strategy to increase milk consumption among Americans. Thanks to these commercials, producer Jerry Bruckheimer noticed the young director and offered Bay to shoot a commercial for the movie Days of Thunder. Bruckheimer was pleased with the result, and when he began preparing for the film Bad Boys, he immediately thought of Bay as the ideal candidate for the director's chair. In April 1995, the film was released and became a box office hit. With a budget of $19 million, the film managed to gross $140 million. The production of the film was a real test for Bay. The director constantly had to be inventive to not exceed the rather modest budget. For example, Bay had to shoot a scene in one day that ideally would have taken 4 days of filming. The only thing Bay was not ready to compromise on were the explosions, especially the final explosion scene, which Michael paid for out of his own pocket, as Sony Studios clearly indicated that they would not add a cent to the production budget. Bay's commitment to his personal beliefs cost him $25,000. The box office success of the film was also reinforced by positive audience reviews, which was not the case with critics, who were constantly distracted by loud explosions while looking for a deeper meaning in Bay's film, something they clearly were not prepared for when going to an action movie. But the critics' ratings didn't bother anyone, and least of all Jerry Bruckheimer, who, seeing the final box office numbers, realized that he definitely did not make a mistake by giving a chance to the young director, and he invited Bay to direct his next project, which was the film The Rock. Again, the production of the film was not without difficulties. At some point, the cost of creating the film became so great that the studio, blaming Bay for inflating the budget, seriously considered firing the director. And it probably would have happened if Sean Connery hadn't stood up for Bay, saying that he would leave if the director was fired. The studio did not dare to argue with a man with the title Sir, and so Hollywood Pictures grudgingly and reluctantly trusted Michael Bay's vision. By the way, this incident was not the only example of the studio's special treatment of Sean Connery. For example, so that the actor didn't have to spend a lot of time traveling to the next shooting location, Hollywood Pictures built a small house for Connery right next to Alcatraz prison. No matter what concession the studio had to make, they all paid off after the film was released. The film, with a budget of $75 million, that grossed $335 million at the box office. Audiences were thrilled, as they were with Bay's previous film, but this time the critics also agreed, considering The Rock to be the best action film of 1995. For many, The Rock remains a favorite film, like for Guillermo del Toro and Cristiano Ronaldo. When asked by journalists which of the films he directed is his favorite, Bay didn't hesitate to name the action film with Connery and Cage. After a series of financially successful projects, the studios no longer had questions for Bay. And for his next film, the director was allowed to go all out, allocating $140 million to watch how Bruce Willis and his team saved the world from a gigantic asteroid. Armageddon was released on June 30th, 1998, and it became one of the biggest blockbusters of that period. Critics, having taken a break from The Rock, continued to pummel Bay's films in their usual manner, accusing Armageddon of lacking logic and credibility. Meanwhile, audiences true to form flocked to buy tickets for showings. In the end, the film managed to garner a box office total of $553 million. The film not only sparked a frenzy in theaters, but also beyond. For instance, the soundtrack performed by Aerosmith became an absolute hit and led various music charts for a long time, even winning an Oscar for Best Original Song. NASA astronauts developed a unique love for the film, as it became sort of a manual on what not to do. During training, potential astronauts are tasked with finding as many errors in the film as possible. If you ever want to join NASA, here's a tip. The film contains a total of 168 inconsistencies. Regardless of the controversies Bay films may have incited, his career skyrocketed just as unequivocally and astonishingly. Within a few years, Bay transformed from a little-known director of commercials and music videos into one of Hollywood's top-grossing directors. The speed at which Bay managed to shoot his films was also surprising. The gap between his works was a maximum of 3 years. Keeping to his schedule, Bay released the movie Pearl Harbor in 2001. Audiences, as usual, bought tickets in droves to see the director's latest large-scale creation, generating $450 million in box office revenue for the film. However, this time, there were noticeably fewer satisfied viewers than in the case of Bay's previous films. Having won only one Oscar, and that in the category of Best Sound Editing, the film was laden with nominations for the Golden Raspberry Award, with neither Bay nor the main cast, including Ben Affleck, Josh Hartnett, and Kate Beckinsale, being overlooked by the award organizers. This time, the critics' reproaches for the implausibility of Bay's films sounded more substantial, because the film was a war drama based on real events and yet contained a significant number of historical inaccuracies. Bay even stumbled in his beloved product placement, showing Jack Daniels in a bottle that did not exist at that time, as evidenced by the awards on the bottle, which were awarded to the company much later than the events shown in the film. Even in the camp of opponents of Bay's molecular film analysis, things were not all calm this time. The love triangle storyline did not appeal to everyone, and many questioned the actors' performances. In the end, for that period, Pearl Harbor became Bay's lowest-rated work among Western audiences. Keeping pace, Bay, 2 years later, revisited theaters, this time with the first sequel in his career, Bad Boys 2. As with all sequels of any successful movie, the budget of the continuation increased, but in the case of Bad Boys, the difference was colossal. The production cost for the second part amounted to $130 million, which was $111 million more than the original. A large part of the enormous budget went to Smith and Lawrence's salaries. The final box office takings of the film amounted to $273 million, which of course did not make the producers rich, but at the same time did not turn into a flop, as most of the box office revenue came from American distribution, where the conditions are most comfortable for Hollywood studios, and of course, Bay's beloved product placement was nowhere to be found, which allowed to recoup part of the budget even before the film was released. In terms of ratings, there were no major differences between the sequel and the original film. It was also highly rated by viewers and equally disliked by critics. In the film, by the way, there was also a brief appearance by 15-year-old Megan Fox, who was given a few seconds of screen time. But this was enough for her to resurface in Bay's memory when choosing actors for the main roles in Transformers. The release of the film also marked that Bad Boys 2 was the last joint project for Bay and Bruckheimer. In 2005, Bay went to Spielberg, but this time not to bring him a portion of freshly brewed coffee, but to release his next project under the DreamWorks studio. There is a version, which I described in detail in a video dedicated to the failure of the film The Island, that Spielberg's decision to entrust the shooting of the film to Bay was dedicated by Steven's selfish considerations. I'll briefly recap the essence. At the beginning of the '90s, Bay was going to film the sci-fi novel The Tripods, which in its concept strongly resembled War of the Worlds, which Spielberg was going to shoot. Learning about Bay's plans, Spielberg decided to offer Michael to shoot The Island, giving him just a few days to think about it, otherwise the offer would go to another director. Bay, for whom working with Spielberg was a childhood dream, decided not to refuse such a chance and, dropping the tripods, started shooting The Island, and Spielberg, with one shot, killed two birds without fearing competition from the box office Bay. He calmly started shooting War of the Worlds and could also make a decent amount on The Island, being the producer of the film. Only the last point was not destined to come true. The film, with a budget of $126 million, managed to collect $162 million in theaters, of which only $35 million came from home distribution. Thus, The Island became the biggest flop of Michael Bay's career and remains so to this day. But at least in terms of ratings, there were no unpleasant surprises. The film, as usual, was liked by the audience and disliked by the critics. Whether it was out of guilt or for some other reason, when DreamWorks began producing a movie based on the world-famous Hasbro toys, Spielberg flatly refused to see anyone but Bay in the director's chair. Bay, in turn, flatly refused to sit in that chair, feeling that making a movie based on toys was beneath his dignity. After a $20 million advance, Bay changed his mind, and to ensure the director did not back out, the studio added a percentage of the final box office gross to the deal, which, fast-forwarding a bit, allowed Bay to earn $75 million on the first installment. Agreeing to participate in the project, Bay made one condition. To avoid the film appearing too childish, the American military had to be present. The love was mutual, and the US Department of Defense, in a show of support for the project, allowed the use of its aircraft image for Starscream, and also approved the shooting of an F-22 plane, which had only previously appeared in the 2003 Hulk movie. For the leading roles in this future project, Bay invited the somewhat known Shia LaBeouf and the unknown Megan Fox, whom the director had met during the filming of the Bad Boys sequel. Thus began the era of Michael Bay's Transformers. The first installment of Transformers was released in the summer of 2007. When the movie grossed $70 million at the box office just on its opening weekend, it became clear that this was a blockbuster hit. The film ended up grossing $709 million, with a $319 million coming from US theaters. In addition to the box office frenzy, there was also a boom in toys and other Transformer-themed merchandise, which sold like hotcakes, much to Hasbro's delight. The box office success of the film was also supported by positive reviews from viewers and even critics, who this time seemed to have reconciled with the fact that it's pointless to look for any deep meaning in Bay's films and allowed themselves to simply just enjoy what was happening on screen. And there was indeed much to enjoy. As someone who grew up on the Transformers cartoon series, I truly felt a childhood joy watching the movie, and not sure if this is something to be proud of, I watched Bay's film 6 times in theaters. The soundtrack, the visuals, the charismatic lead characters. It seemed like Bay had finally hit the bullseye on all fronts. Fairly speaking, even among my acquaintances, there were those who called Transformers a mindless ride. But to me, such movies are an integral part of the film industry, and watching such films doesn't make you a cinematically ignorant person incapable of appreciating high art in cinema. Even more so, if this ride is executed at the highest level, then why not enjoy it? The good thing is that you can see the outstanding work Bay did in recreating the first Transformers 16 years after the premiere of his film by watching Rise of the Beasts, where there is not only script degradation but also visual. Although, you would think that in 15 years technology should have moved forward, not back. However, it should be said that in Bay's Transformers Kingdom, not everything was smooth either when the sequel called Revenge of the Fallen was released in 2009. Paramount Studios began work on the sequel as soon as it saw the multi-million-dollar deposits on its accounts after the release of the first part, but it happened that the production of the sequel coincided with the strike of the Writers Guild. By the time that the strike started, the director already had script drafts, and Bay thought that he himself was a sort of scriptwriter and decided to fill the missing gaps in the script on his own. It cannot be said that this experiment was successful. This time, the script raised many questions not only from critics but also from viewers. Most noticeable were the jokes for 300, which the film was filled with. Critics who barely restrained themselves from reproaches to the first part let themselves go in their devastating reviews of the sequel. The film received 6 nominations for the Golden Raspberry Award, and Bay was even awarded a statue as the worst director. There were no questions only to the visual, which was still on top. There were more Transformers, and they became even more intricate and more varied. The final note was a special request from Hasbro, who were surprisingly happy about not being able to supply new shipments of toys to the stores. Despite the fact that viewer ratings fell slightly compared to the first part, box office revenues increased and amounted to $836 million. Bay was so in love with the Transformers that he even postponed the production of the film Pain and Gain, which he planned to shoot immediately after the premiere of the first part, fearing that the studio would not want to wait for him long and entrust the shooting of the franchise to someone else. Bay's love for the Transformers was also driven by the fact that when starting work on the sequel, the director refused in advance and in return received a percentage of all sources of film income, including from DVD and Blu-ray releases. It is rumored that even Cameron raised his eyebrow in surprise upon learning of such a contract. Full of love for the Transformers, Bay started producing the third part. However, on the way to shooting, Megan Fox had to be dropped, who fell in love with various interviews, and everything would be fine if the actress did not mention Michael Bay in them, showing him in not the best light. So, Fox said that Bay, during the casting, almost forced her to wash his car in a bikini and deliberately sexualized the actress's image. And also, by the way, compared Bay to Hitler. I don't know what hurt Bay more, the comparison with the Fuhrer, or the fact that he scrimped a few dollars on a car wash. But after that, the director stopped sexualizing the actress as well as filming her in his films. True, later Fox herself began to perfectly cope with the sexualization of her image, appearing in public in similar outfits. The third part of Transformers was released in the summer of 2011, as was customary. Traditionally, the film made critics convulse at the mention of the script in their reviews, while the audience, they just couldn't care less about critics' opinions, and movie theaters were packed with people wanting to see the next battles between Autobots and Decepticons. In the end, the film grossed $1.12 billion on a budget of $195 million, becoming the highest-grossing film of Bay's career and marking the first trilogy in his career. The audience ratings were even more restrained this time. This was primarily due to changes in the cast, as many had grown accustomed to Megan Fox and could not come to terms with her absence in the film. Additionally, the film got into a rather unusual situation when particularly observant viewers noticed that a highway chase scene shown in the film was borrowed from another Bay film, The Island. There are two versions explaining the director's self-repetition. The first suggests that Bay resorted to such a move because a member of the film crew was injured during the shooting of the chase scene, resulting in the shooting having to be interrupted and an already completed scene from another film being inserted. The second version suggests that Bay simply decided not to bother and inserted a fragment from The Island which perfectly fit the particular scene. Besides, the director had previously made similar manipulations, even with Transformers, when in the first part he inserted a shot of an aircraft carrier from the film Pearl Harbor. After an exhausting 5-year marathon with the Transformers releasing films every 2 years, Bay decided to take a well-deserved break, as did Shia LaBeouf, who also believed it was time to say goodbye to the Transformers. While LaBeouf got caught up in various performances, Bay finally got around to the film Pain and Gain, which he had planned to shoot back in 2008. After Transformers, the budget for the film looked ridiculous and amounted to only $20 million. To fit within the allocated budget, Bay persuaded Mark Wahlberg and Dwayne Johnson to cut their fees. The film's premiere once again caused discrepancies in the assessment of critics and viewers. Only this time, the situation was the exact opposite. Critics generally praised the film, while viewers rated the film rather restrained. Nevertheless, The Mountains of Muscles managed to gross $86 million at the box office on a budget of $26 million. What initially seemed like a full-fledged break from the Transformers franchise turned out to just be a short breather, and in 2013, Bay was once again in the director's chair for a film about Autobots, bringing Marky Mark to replace Shia LaBeouf, who had left the franchise for good. In terms of reviews, everything had come full circle. Almost. Critics were habitually lambasting every aspect of the film, excluding visuals. Meanwhile, audiences continued to show admirable loyalty to the Transformers franchise, but it was quite noticeable that there were significantly fewer of such viewers. It also became increasingly obvious that the creators couldn't offer anything new, and with each new film, it seemed more like they were parasitizing the love of audience for the original franchise entries and extracting money from their pockets. Speaking of which, the film performed brilliantly in this respect, and ultimately grossed $1.1 billion, which automatically triggered the production of the fifth installment, which Bay, it seemed, signed on for out of inertia. But Cybertron, which Bay had never fully showcased in his films, did not erase the director's desire to tell more human and grounded stories. Therefore, before starting on the 5th Transformers movie, Bay took on the task of working on the film 13 Hours, The Secret Soldiers of Benghazi, based on real events. As with Pain and Gain, Bay once again managed to win over critics, but this time, audiences also reacted favorably to his new film, awarding The Soldiers of Benghazi high ratings. However, the film failed to achieve success at the box office, grossing just $60 million on a $50 million budget. But Bay had long had a working formula for collecting money in theaters, although this time, it failed. In 2017, the final installment of the Autobots Adventures from Michael Bay was released. This time, everything the critics had been harping about the Transformers was echoed loudly by the audience. Aside from the visuals, there was nothing in the film that could appeal to viewers. Even Anthony Hopkins couldn't help. His presence in the film seemed out of place rather than enhancing it. This time, it became quite clear that everyone was tired of the Transformers, as was clearly shown by the film's box office receipts, which were the lowest of all the franchise films, totaling $605 million. According to some Western analysts, Paramount even suffered losses of $100 million from the box office results. But most importantly, it became noticeable that Bay himself was tired of the Transformers, and I personally got the impression that he was shooting the last part in a hurry, just to part ways with the once beloved franchise as quickly as possible. The director later confirmed these suspicions in one of his interviews, stating that he should have stopped at the 3rd part as advised by Steven Spielberg. But evil and greedy corporations begged him to continue filming, flooding him with millions of dollars, and Bay yielded to them. This is not a verbatim retelling of the director's interview, but the gist is about the same. Having gotten Transformers out of his system, Bay finally took a deep breath and moved on to Netflix, where he immediately tested the streaming giant's wallet by making 6 Underground, with a budget of $150 million. It's difficult to say whether these expenditures paid off, as the film was exclusively released on Netflix, but within the first 4 weeks of its premiere, it was viewed by 85 million viewers, which is considered quite a good indicator. However, the film received rather restrained reviews from both critics and viewers. It seems that a love for car chases replaced his love for Transformers, and Bay continued in this direction, releasing the film Ambulance in 2022. This time, the film made it to the theaters, but it was yet another reminder that viewers were not very eager to watch Bay's movies if they're not Transformers. In the end, the film grossed only $50 million with a budget of $40 million, but it did manage to impress the critics, who did not hold back in their praise of the film. It seems that the less money Bay's films made at the box office, the more the critics liked them. However, viewers didn't seem to be very impressed by Bay's response to the film's speed, and gave the film quite average ratings. At present, Ambulance is the latest project directed by Michael Bay. The next film that the director is set to take on is Robopocalypse, which does not yet have a tentative release date, but if you look at the gap between the director's previous films, it can be assumed that the premiere will take place in 2025. As I said at the beginning of the video, Michael Bay is a controversial figure in the film industry. Some people are ready to rush headlong to the premiere of his new films in the cinema, while others spit at the number of cliches in his films and the lack of originality in them. But what personally earns my respect for Bay, even though I can't count him among my favorite directors, is his honesty with himself and his viewers, which probably evokes popular sympathy. Bay doesn't claim this trendy word visionary, but does what he dreamed of doing during his studies at university, namely shooting action films with plenty of spectacular action scenes, and he does it, in my personal view, quite well, all while having his own style thanks to which you don't even have to mention his name in the credits and viewers will still understand whose film it is. Only a small portion of directors can boast of something similar. On this note, I'll conclude my video. This was the story of Michael Bay. If you liked the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.